So welcome everyone and Happy New Year to you all. My name is Marc-André Pigeon, Marc-André Pigeon. I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. Today's talk is especially interesting to me because it aims to challenge our fundamental way of thinking and transferring knowledge and thinking about how we do that. It asks about whether the approach we've taken has led to drawbacks, blind spots, and gaps. And of course, these things can have negative implications for our society, as we were just talking about before we came on live. And ask whether there is another way that educational processes can help us flourish as human beings, fully realized human beings. And in saying this, and in talking about Lene's talk, live from Denmark, by the way, coming up, I'm reminded of indigenous ways of knowing and learning, and the lessons we as non-indigenous settlers are only beginning to scratch the surface of. Take for example the seventh generation principle, based on the ancient Haudenosaunee Iroquois philosophy, that the decisions we make today should result in sustainable world 7 generations into the future. This principle is incredibly powerful, important, and I think it challenges us to think differently. And ideally, in the cooperative model, you see this kind of thinking as well, thinking beyond the short term to a longer term intergenerational perspective. So with that kind of blending of Lene's talk and this kind of indigenous learning perspective, I want to acknowledge that we're coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. It's also the traditional homeland of the Métis nations. We're grateful for this opportunity to work on this land, share in its bounty, reflect on its beauty, and reaffirm our commitment to the hard and shared and necessary work of reconciliation, and also to have this opportunity to reflect on these notions of 7 generations and thinking across time. Now, with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce you our speaker today, Lene Rachel Andersen. Now, Lene is a wide-ranging and impressive, or has a wide-ranging and impressive background. She's an economist, an author, a futurist, a philosopher, and a Bildung activist. You're going to learn more about what that means in a minute. But since 2005, she's written 20 books, and amongst these are the Nordic Secret, that I'm currently reading as part of a book club reading that was published in 2007, and it's being updated, as Lene was just telling us. Another book called Bildung. Again, we're going to talk about that concept in a minute. Keep Growing, published in 2020. What is Bildung? You can see a theme here, published in 2021. Libertism, published in 2022. And Polymodernity, Meaning and Hope in a Complex World, something we badly need, published just last year. I'd be remiss if I also didn't mention that Lene is a full member of the Club of Rome, president of the Copenhagen-based think tank Nordic Bildung, and co-founder of the Global Bildung Network. So before we hear from Lene, a few words on our co-op conversation series. For those of you who are new, we're going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes hearing from Lene. She's going to introduce this concept of the Nordic Bildung and the lessons it offers for cooperatives. Then we're going to have a short conversation followed by all of us breaking out into groups around a question that Lene is going to pose to us. We're going to do that for about 15, 20 minutes. Then we'll regroup, have a bit of a plenary conversation, and close things down. Now, while we always lose a few people before or after the talk and before the breakout, one thing we hear repeatedly in our evaluations is just how much people value these informal opportunities to get to know each other in these breakouts. So if you're kind of on the fence, give it a try, give it a shot, and you might find you'd make some interesting connections. They're a great way to meet new people, to kind of sit in the awkwardness of newness, and to grow from there. And I think these are themes that are resonant a little bit with Lene's talk. Finally, if anyone's experiencing any technical difficulties, you can message Stan Yu. And Stan, can you just wave to folks?
Hi, everyone.
There he is. And Stan will help you out as best he can. Finally, we're going to be recording this session, and the link will be shared with everyone who's registered after the event. So all that will be emailed to you later on. So, Lene, this is now your turn to talk. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Great pleasure to visit Canada on a Wednesday evening where it's pouring down or snowing here in Copenhagen. I will introduce the concept of Bildung, and then I'll talk a bit about Nordic history, and then we're going to have a discussion. I'm going to talk about the education that we've developed here in the Nordic countries, which now I reveal it is the Nordic Secret. I don't know if you're aware of that, but Denmark and Canada just solved a border dispute, and we did that in an extremely civilized manner. It's actually I hope I don't offend any indigenous peoples here by calling it a piece of rock in the middle of nowhere. But as the ice is melting, there really is nothing on it except now the land border between Denmark and Canada. I know that the Inuits have used a sort of a stopover between Canada and Greenland and other places in the Arctic. But for, I don't know, 30 years or so, our navies have exchanged booze on the planet. I don't know if it were the Canadians or the Danes who started, but somebody's navy left, and in Canada it was whiskey, I think, saying this island belongs to Canada. And then the Danish navy came and took the booze, put up a bottle of Danish schnapps, potato vodka, whatever you want to call it, and said, "Welcome to Denmark." And we've been exchanging uh, alcohol on Hans Island for I think 30 years until last week or so, actually December 19th. An agreement between Denmark and Canada was ratified, and we now share the island. So there's a land border between our two countries now. And I think the civilized way of dealing with this is really important. I know that nobody lives there and sort of claims it as their homeland, but still, I think that we have been able to solve something like that through mutual agreement, and actually having a sense of humor about it speaks well of both countries. So I'm actually proud of that. And we live in a time where saying that you're proud of your country can be misunderstood by a lot of people, and nationalism has become a curse word almost. And on the other hand, we cannot have thriving countries if we do not have love of that country, if we don't identify with it, if we're not caring enough about it to want to take responsibility for it. And in the Nordic countries, particularly in Denmark, we have built up a sense of national identity that has, for many years, been um, sort of very self-aggrandizing in some ways, but also very peaceful. And it doesn't need the other for us in order to identify as who we are and know who we are. And how did we do that? That is where Bildung comes into the place. And it's not Bildung, it's Bildung. Bild means image in German, and we got the concept from Germany. And in the 1600s, when Europe was still a very religious continent, it was part of the pietistic movement, a very spiritual kind of Christianity, and you were supposed to shape yourself in the image of Christ. So that is where the build comes in, the image. So it was a Christian image of what would the true, good Christian spiritual person be like, and how can I live up to that? So that will be Bildung. And then with the Enlightenment and the development in the 1700s, this Bildung concept kind of leaves mainstream of the European culture and kind of disappears until the philosopher Herder picks it up and makes it a secular concept, where the image, is you unfolding and you shaping yourself in the image of you and your personal character. So it becomes personal character development, and Bildung becomes part of um, discovering what it means to be a people. So here the nation comes in, because part of who you are I mean, it is related to your language, your cultural heritage, your lore, your traditions, and everything that you share with other people around you. And that is usually through culture, a symbolic world of rituals and beliefs and shared values and language and music and aesthetics and all kinds of stuff. So Bildung has very much to do with culture. It's about being cultivated into your culture. It's also about being cultivated when you leave your culture. So we have the concept of the Bildungsreise, the Bildung journey, where when you're 18, 25, they're about a young adult, and you know enough about your own culture to kind of provide for yourself and be an autonomous adult. Then you go on a longer journey. It was something they did in the bourgeoisie. They send out their sons on a Bildungsreise so that they encountered a different culture, lived there for a while, and then they came back and they had a different perspective on things. So their character was molded by these strange encounters with a different culture, and then you settle into it and you eat their food and you learn their habits and you sort of accommodate and you become part of it, integrate into it. And you may not, I mean, at first the other people seem a little bit strange, maybe very strange, but you get used to it and you become part of what they do. And then when you go back, you realize that this it's your own culture that was strange, because you can actually make sense in both ways, and both cultures seem to work. And something inside you has changed. You have become more you with two different cultures inside you because you cannot choose between them. And you can see things from both perspectives. And you will have to figure out, so what do you think about it? Because you can't just use all the answers from one culture or from the other culture. You have to figure out, so what is my answer to this? So that would be a Bildungsreise. And the way that I now describe Bildung is that it is two different kinds of knowledge. So I worked with this for, as Marc-André said, for the past 10 years, uh, really focused on this. And it has taken me a while to develop this description of it. But how I describe Bildung now is that it's two different kinds of knowledge. And one kind of knowledge is the kind of knowledge that is relatively easy to transfer from person to person. So that is academic knowledge. It can be practical knowledge, such as repairing a bicycle or booking a train ticket online or something like that. Um, or it can be learning a language. And you can test or figure out if the other person that you tried to transfer this knowledge to has actually picked it up and understood it, if they can reproduce it. So that is the kind of knowledge we can test. And you can, I mean, it's horizontal transfer, but you can also expand your horizon in all kinds of directions. So I call this the horizontal kind of knowledge. And then there's a different kind of knowledge that is impossible to transfer from person to person, and we call it the vertical knowledge. It's life experience, it's your emotional depth, it's the knowledge that comes from becoming a good friend, falling in love, being married, being heartbroken, raising a family, having children, keeping a job, handling you know, an impossible boss or difficult colleagues, and all this stuff that you just have to learn by doing and by making mistakes and having successes, and then you kind of reflect on, so why did this work and why did that not work? And if you have one of these experiences, like falling in love, and you try to tell it to somebody and share it with somebody, if they've never experienced it, they're going to be like, yeah, so, okay, you met this guy and it's fantastic. And yeah, yeah. And you kiss. Okay, fair enough. But if they have been in love, they know exactly how you're feeling and there is a resonance. But you cannot transfer that experience of being in love the same way that you can transfer the knowledge about how to book a train ticket online. There's different kind of knowledge. And there's also the moral aspirations, the upbringing. When we bring children up, we do it because we want them to aim higher. We want them to behave in a certain way that is acceptable within our culture. So here comes the culture and the symbolic world into the whole thing. So that's part of our upbringing. There's this vertical development aspect to it, and it's a vertical development. It's a different kind of development than the horizontal one. And the combination of the two, the interplay between the two, the struggle with getting your emotions and your life experience to make sense and use them in the sort of horizontal knowledge sphere is Bildung. And on the one hand, it is a social thing because you can only do this together with other people. I mean, you can go back to your living room, close the door, and think about things on your own. But your life experience and a lot of what you learn comes from interacting with other people. So it's a social thing. It's a communal thing. It's a cultural thing. You do it in a social and cultural context. On the other hand, it is always deeply individual because we're all born with different talents and different interests, and different urges and drives and different personalities. And so what makes sense to one person doesn't make sense to another person, and we will understand things differently and handle them differently. And we can never fully grasp what other people are experiencing. So Bildung is both individual and horizontal and vertical and social and communal. And you always, I mean, as long as you're around other people, you will have some kind of addition to your existing Bildung, because we still learn as we live. And so you're never done with this. Um, you cannot talk about a, a person with or without Bildung. We all have Bildung, we all have some of it, but you can talk about, is this person, do they have the Bildung appropriate for their age? We expect different things from somebody who's 35 than from somebody who's 15 or 5 for that matter. We all go to, if we have a really big problem and we still have our grandmother, we go to our grandmother and ask for advice, not our 12-year-old cousin. So this is part of how we mature. And the concept of Bildung was German, and the philosophy around it, and that was in the 1770s onwards until the early 1800s. And among the other philosophers were Friedrich Schiller and Fichte, who talked a lot about nation building and nation Bildung. And then there was Hegel, and then there was Wilhelm von Humboldt, who actually started the university in Berlin and deliberately brought wanted Bildung to be part of what it meant to be a university. It was not just about the horizontal transfer of knowledge. They wanted to promote this cultivation of people's uh, personalities. So that used to be in our educational systems and also in the Anglophone part of the world, and even into the Francophone part of the world, as far as I know. So it has been there in our educational systems for at least 200 years. So that is the Bildung part. But in Germany, this was very much among the bourgeoisie, and we're back in a feudal society where you had the kings, then you had the clergy, then you had the aristocracy, and then you had the third estate, which in the medieval time was basically peasants and some artisans. With the printing press, colonialism, capitalism, and modern science, there was this layer of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, who got richer and richer and wanted political power. And they also had this Bildungbürgertum, this Bildung bourgeoisie. The ideal for the Bildung, for the for the bourgeoisie was to have a lot of Bildung, a lot of education, because they couldn't have political power, but they could have education and money. Um, so they kept this Bildung thing for themselves. In Denmark, there was a pastor in the early 1800s who figured that the French Revolution, that was a bloodbath, bad idea. We don't want that in Denmark. And there was also a crown prince and other people who realized that if the poorest people, so in the rest of Europe, that I think there was a general assumption that if the poor people, the farmers, the peasants, the workers, if they knew too much, they would make a revolution. In Denmark, many different places among bourgeoisie and this particular pastor, there was this. They were convinced that if the peasants didn't know enough, they would make a revolution. So Denmark prioritized education, public education, very early on. And then there was this pastor who realized that it's not just the horizontal kind of knowledge, he called it something else. It's not just that everybody needs school knowledge. They also need Bildung. We need folk Bildung. We need popular Bildung. We need it for the peasants. And they could tell that industrialization was coming. Denmark was one of the poorest European countries until 1850. Um, and we couldn't afford to have an ignorant, uneducated proletariat. We needed to have Bildung and education throughout all strata of society. And so he came up with the idea of a folk college or a folk high school, which was supposed to do two things. One was give them the knowledge about what is Denmark, what does it mean to be a citizen, because most uh, biggest part of, I mean, the majority of the rural population would have identified with their village or the nearest market town. They wouldn't have realized that they were Danes and citizens. They needed to learn that and to relate to the fact that you're now part of a nation state and you're a citizen. And that comes with obligations and not privileges, but rights. So the all strata of society should understand that. So there needed to be something for the rural community. And so this pastor named Grundtvig, Nikolai Frederick Severin Grundtvig, came up with the idea for a folk high school. And he developed the idea based on the colleges in Cambridge, UK, on Swiss pedagogue Pestalozzi and his pedagogical philosophy, on Rousseau's thinking about emotional development from the novel Emile, and those German Bildung thinkers. So it had a very strong national agenda, but it was inspired by thinkers and events in the rest of Europe. And the first folk high school was started in 1844, and nobody knew how to do a folk high school, so it was incredibly boring. It was only the richest farmers' sons who could afford to go there. And then we got into a war with Prussia in 1848, which ended in an armistice in 1851. And that war created this strong nationalistic sense of we're Danes. So the collective sense of self emerged. It had been there before among the bourgeoisie, but bigger parts of the population realized that they were Danes. And then there was a teacher who felt very strongly about this whole Danish thing, and he used to teach children, and whenever he taught them what he was supposed to teach them, they didn't pay attention. But when he told them stories, they did pay attention. And he wanted to make one of those folk high schools, and he wanted to make it for the 18 to 25-year-olds, which was the whole idea with the folk high school. It should be for young adults. And it should be a boarding school. And what he wanted to do was to first get their attention and get them interested by telling them stories. And once he had their attention, uh, and as he said, first enliven, then enlighten. Then he would ask them questions, and then they would ask him questions because they wanted to know stuff. And then they had a conversation going, and then they were ready to learn. So he figured out, how do I teach young people? I mean, even back then, they were not that interested in all the book learning. Um, and he got that by getting to know them and by telling them stories and relating to them. And then the folk high school was always thought of as and conceived as a boarding school. So they moved into the same farmhouse, about 25 of them, with this teacher, another teacher, and the teacher's name was Christian Colt. His 23-year-old sister was there cooking for all the young men. Um, and um, and then they studied together, and she taught them all kinds of household skills, and Colt and the other teacher taught them all kinds of new agricultural techniques, so they had useful knowledge when they got back to their farm. And then they studied the Bible and discussed it, and they sang all kinds of new songs. I mean, that would have been like the first one finding the coolest YouTube video and sharing it before everybody else and before it went viral. Here they learned the new songs, went back to their village and sang all this, new stuff and became the cool kids in their village. So it was a huge success from 1851 with the young farm boys who went to this folk high school that he started. But that was just one school, and it was really hard to get more students coming. And there was another really cool thing, two actually groundbreaking principles at the school. There could be no exams, so you had to go and study there because you wanted to learn. And the other thing was that everybody lived there together on the same terms, so it had to be homey, and the young men could not have the sense of being intimidated by the teachers or social norms that they were not used to. So he really figured out how to do this. And then Denmark got into war with Bismarck and Germany or Prussia in 1864, where we lost 1/3 of the country, and the Danes panicked, and then they started all these folk high schools because that was a way of teaching young people, what does it mean to be a Dane, what is our culture like, and who are we as a nation. And we've done that ever since. It's not so Danish focused anymore. Now it's more Europe focused. It has different schools. There are 70 of them in Denmark. They're still boarding schools. The program is about 5 months. The main target group is 18 to 25-year-olds. It's very typical to take a gap year after high school in Denmark. So typically young people complete high school, then they go working for 6 months, save up money, and then they go to a folk high school and stay there for 5 months and deep dive into their special point of interest, such as playing the guitar, studying history, doing ceramics, learning how to make film. And then there is this cultural um, input and discussions and philosophy and history lessons and getting to know about the world and discussing. So what is important in life, and the main question is, who am I and who would I want to be as a person? And you do that not by meditating and looking into yourself, but by studying all kinds of things and discussing them and figuring out, so what is my viewpoint on this? Why do I think the way that I do? Why do I believe this is true and not that thing? And why do I think this is morally right and that thing is morally wrong? Why do I think that? So it's a very conversational way of getting to know yourself, but also getting to know others and live together with them. And it is very Bildung promoting, because you really learn about yourself when you live together with that many people. Maybe, I mean, the folk high schools today have typically between 50 and 150 students at a time. And since 1870, it's about 10% of the annual cohort who's been attending one of these schools. So it's not everybody, but it's a critical proportion of the annual cohort who go through this process of figuring out what is important in life, and what is my society like, and what does it mean to be a citizen, and with no test and no right or wrong answers. Just the exploration is the whole point. And what does this have to do with the cooperatives? Because there is actually a connection. Because it turns out that many of the people, so we got the idea, the concept of the cooperatives from the Rochdale Society in the UK. There's another Danish pastor who started the first bread sale as a cooperative in a small town. And he did that with the workers. And he literally copy pasted the bylaws from one of the UK cooperatives, maybe the Rochdale Society itself, but he added that 2.5% of the profit in the cooperative should be spent on education. And then the workers began starting their own cooperative bread sales, which then became stores that sold all kinds of stuff. And that was in 1866, I think. And in the 1870s, a lot of those young farmhands who had been to one of the folk high schools saw the potential in this, and then they started cooperative dairies and slaughterhouses and chicken farms and banks and all kinds of things together. And there's an overlap between the young people in the rural community who went to a folk high school and the people who were very active in the cooperative movement. And one of my hypotheses, and I talked to Mark Andre about this when we spoke some months ago, because what I see happened in Denmark is that the workers created the cooperative market before the cooperative farmers created the cooperative production companies. So there was actually a market that could receive all this cooperatively produced eggs, butter, bacon, and everything that Denmark then started exporting, because the farmers could produce standardized, high quality foodstuffs for export. So there is a connection between the Bildung, the education, the studying for the sake of studying, the personal development, the getting engaged in your local community, taking responsibility for cooperatives, and being an active citizen. And all of these cooperatives, part of so I spent 2 years researching and writing the Nordic Secret, and there's a new edition coming out in January. It's a rather thick book. part of looking into this, because I can't rerun history and say that the secret behind the success of the Nordic countries is the folk high schools and this whole movement. But I can look at some statistics, and one of the statistics that I found is that the highest numbers of members of cooperatives are among the Swiss, the Danes, the Swedes, the Finns, and Norwegians. And then I think Canada and the US. So these countries that are extremely happy and well organized and peaceful and have all these good country qualities also, at least what I saw, have a high proportion of people who are members of cooperatives. So we have this democratic training out in our local communities. And that among the folk high schools and this approach to education, which is then sort of seeped into our entire educational system, not learning for the tests, not having all kinds of goals that you need to meet, but unfolding as a person. That's the goal of education. That is from preschool, kindergarten, uh, somewhat into university, but definitely through public school and high school. And that is the Nordic secret. And so my question here is, what would be the Canadian secret? Because I'm really curious. So that would be my presentation. I spent more time than I was supposed to, but that's the way I am. I'm sorry about that.
No, thank you, Lena. That was wonderful. It was very engaging. And people stuck around, so that's a good sign. We are going to do a breakout in just a minute, but Lena, I have to ask you, co-op principle number 5 is around education and training and information. It seems very consonant with this Bildung movement. And of course, here in Saskatchewan, we just lost a phenomenal co-op educator. His name is Harold Chapman. He was 105 years old, I think, thereabouts. But he would always make the argument that education is the core of cooperatives, right? If you don't know about the model, and you don't understand it in a kind of I think in your horizontal and vertical sense, then the model itself is at risk. And I'm just curious. So there's a really strong link there that you and I talked about and would love to explore, time permitting. But the question that comes to mind for me is, how important is that democratic component to the Bildung? Sorry, and I'm going to get the pronunciation right. Bildung. How important is that to the development of the character? Both in this vertical and horizontal dimension. And then we'll do your breakout question after that.
I don't think that. Well, the education is, when we say democracy, we tend to think of voting or referendums of different kinds. But democracy is really a culture, and one of the most famous Danish thinkers on culture was another theologian who said that democracy is a culture. And so it's everything that happens between the referendums and the elections. So it's the way that we meet, it's the way that we negotiate, it's the way that we compromise, it's the way that we and part of Bildung is that you can actually not just have tolerant values, but that you actually are tolerant. That you can be in the room with and even have a civilized conversation with somebody with whom you completely disagree on just about everything. And even people that you may think are despicable, immoral people. You can be in the same room and still contain yourself and behave and let them speak so that you can hear what it is they're actually thinking and how they're reasoning. And so there is an extremely important democratic element. You need to be able to handle that people say and think and believe things that you find, totally wrong in every way, and then figure out how can I connect with this person, or at least figure out why they think the way they do, or understand why they think the way that they do. And that's not easy. I won't say it becomes easier with age, but it becomes more common with age. So that's part of your Bildung too. And so there you have the democracy, because if we can't tolerate that other people disagree with us, or have and I would even say, as much as I hate racism and misogyny, if I cannot be in the room with somebody who expresses this, and at least, be able to say, but why do you think that? can't you see it from this point of view? Or, I mean, get into a conversation. Then I'm not capable of maintaining a democracy, because then I can just run away from all the wrong viewpoints, and there won't be any way of bringing people into the democratic conversation, sort of perhaps softening some of these very sharp corners. So I think we need to. So there's part of Bildung and democracy meeting, and I would say part of the educational model in the Nordic countries has been very much centered around loving the individual student and seeing them for who they are, and not saying everybody needs to go here and complete this test and score at least, I don't know, 7.3 to be good students. To be a good student is to be who you are in the social context, and developing that respect for everybody else who need to be able to be who they are as well. So pedagogy in the Nordics is very much focused on socializing you into the class, among your classmates, learning what you're in the horizontal transfer of knowledge that is there, of course, must be. But it's not just about that. It's also about how do you relate to the others in your class? How do you behave? And who are you and who would you want to be?
So much to unpack there, but let's go to your question. It's so much fun. Okay, so Stan, we're going to do a breakouts of, let's say, 9 groups of 4 roughly. These are going to fluctuate a little bit because some people are going to drop off right around now. But here we are. We're gonna do the breakouts. The key thing to remember here is you might not know everyone when you go to breakouts, so do some introductions if that is the case. Otherwise, we'd like you to address Lena's question, which is, what is Canada's secret? I think that was it, right, Lena? Something like that. What is
Yeah.
Canada's secret? How are we a functional democracy? And some people
Well,
might
how do you get to be such a great country that you
right,
are? I mean,
right.
now I explained where I think, and I kind of documented why did we get to where we are, but where do you get to where you are?
So that's a
Curious.
provocative question, especially in this day and time era. So let's do the breakouts. It's a good question. It's going to be generative, I think. So Stan, can you do the breakouts, please? What is Canada's secret? Yes.
What is Canada?
And we'll see you back here in about 12 minutes, Stan.
All right.
Yeah.
The breakout groups are starting right now.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Okay, there's Lena. She's back. That's the important person. So this is the plenary portion of our conversation, Lena. So we generally open it up for people to share maybe something that came out of their conversation that they found interesting, or to ask you a question. And we have about 10 minutes, 9 minutes left for that. And so I'll just put a call out to people to kind of share or ask Lena a question.
Or tell us what's the Canadian secret?
Yeah, right. From their conversation. Yeah, exactly. Anyone want to jump in? Who wants to be our
Dick,
first?
did you want to share from our group, Dick?
Sure. We talked around a lot of things, and at the end we kind of talked about Denmark, Germany, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, US. Little country, big country. Just talking about that when you cut us off and ended our conversation. But that is our situation and the situation of all the small countries. And small countries have to be more flexible and adaptable because of that. And I was just saying, I think part of our problem may be that because we speak the same language as our big neighbor, we're swamped with the input that comes from there. It's not good or bad. It does swamp us a little bit, but we have kept our, I guess, goodwill and fairness and cooperative nature, even though we are surrounded by such big neighbors. And our history has not been as violent as some of our neighbors, or as many countries. So we've been lucky with that. We were blessed with a lot of geography and not too much violent history.
All right, thanks, Dick. Anyone else want to weigh in?
I want to say there are a lot of small countries that don't work that well. So
one of the things we talked about in our group was the waves of immigration patterns in Canada, actually, interestingly enough. So Murray, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of the early cooperators in Saskatchewan were actually from the Scandinavian countries. And so I think that we have actually a strong sort of and I actually think a lot of our co-ops, a lot of our structures of our cooperative systems are actually set up very similar to a lot of the Scandinavian, and I'm just learning about this now. Some of the cooperatives in Norway that are set up very similar, like some of the long-standing ones there are set up very similar to some of our long-standing ones here. And so I think there's a connection there that hasn't really been deeply explored. I know Brett Fairburn has written a little bit about this in some of our history. Marie probably could talk more about it, but I think that's interesting. And I think that it's also connected to the fact that Saskatchewan is the home of publicly funded like universal healthcare. And I think it came out of similar kinds of people starting the cooperative movement that came from these countries. So I think there is like a deeper connection. And then somebody else in our group talked about the fact that when people came, there was sort of this confluence of 3 different cultures. Like there was the indigenous culture that had been here forever. And then there was the English and the French, and sort of to try and kind of figure it out, at least in early stages before everything kind of moved away from the notion of sharing and equality and collaboration with indigenous people. You know, I think there was some initial sort of attempts to try and kind of have 3 cultures living side by side. So Michael had brought that up.
Yeah, thank you, John. Lene, do you want any reflections on
I'll
that?
just have I have one comment, which is that Canada is way ahead of Denmark with regards to the indigenous peoples. I mean, the way that we've treated people in Greenland, and still cannot figure out how to talk about Greenland and Greenland people, Inuit people in Greenland. It's just it's like we're still stuck, at least in the 1970s, probably not the 50s, but we're way behind on that. And I wonder if the bilingual status of Canada has played a role, because everybody, at least in theory, must learn 2 languages. So there is that kind of, we need to function together with these other people who don't speak my language culture, and maybe that has created a kind of culture in Canada. I don't know.
I see Jim has his hand up, but go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Lena, for the excellent discussion. I'm actually just going to raise a couple of points that some of my colleagues in the breakout group, because I don't see them jumping in here. So 2 thoughts. One is, I think historically, I think it was John who mentioned this idea that Canada has been a mosaic, not a melting pot. So it's been very purposeful that Canada has tried to undertake a way of welcoming newcomers to the country and adding them to the mosaic, not trying to push everyone into that same sort of melting pot conformity of a single identity. And so I think that's helpful to try to understand other cultures and other perspectives, and a little bit more of a viewpoint of working together, that we all have some common stake in this. We also talked about, at least a couple of us that are from Saskatchewan and Alberta, seeing a bit of a shift that troubles us, because we're seeing a bit of in our local provincial politics, very much a shift to a fairly hard right of center, Trumpish kind of nationalism viewpoint. And again, one of the other folks in a group used the term that we're shifting from a we culture to a me culture, at least in a couple of these couple of provinces. So as much as we look back fondly at how things have gone, fair bit of concern about the future, and moving forward, and where we're going to end up. And again, even reflect on, to my view, and I'm not a student of this, but my sense is that the cooperative culture in Saskatchewan, for example, is nowhere near what it was 50, 60, 70 years ago, right? Like, it seems to be, Mark, you study this, you'd have a better sense of that, but just from my layperson view, it doesn't seem to have anywhere near the sort of interest or traction that it once did.
And
Well, thanks,
not
Jim.
here either.
Not there either. Yeah, that'd be a subject of another co-op conversation. But before we move on, I'm going to get Jen and Carol to weigh in really quickly, and then we'll get Lene to offer some closing comments. Go ahead, Jen.
Oh, sure. I'll be super quick. One of the things we heard in this presentation is that education is at the core of these concepts. And so for us being Canadian, we talked about the history of our education system, particularly the darker side of that, the residential schools. And that part of our character at this point in history is about acknowledging what happened and participating in truth and reconciliation and the calls to action, and imagining how we integrate the accountability there into how we move forward and how we see ourselves in the future.
Thanks, Jen. That's a bit of a positive note in a sense, right? Relative to the more dystopian picture that Jim was painting, which I don't disagree with, Jim, by the way. Carol, your last comments, and then we'll get Lena to say a few last words. Go ahead.
Okay, we didn't finish our discussion, but at least 2 points that were brought up were that we felt that the Canadian approach is partly due to having the challenges of remote communities like those in Arctic areas, that basically the regular commercial activity doesn't seem to go there, and so they have to create cooperatives in order to provide a lot of basic services, such as stores, for example. And then we were thinking about the historically, that during the Dust Bowl, Great Depression era, so around the 1930s, that was kind of an incubator for a lot of development of a sort of cooperative culture, and that maybe just fundamentally being in a very harsh, cold environment, that tends to foster a cooperative approach. And then we had some discussions around democracy and diversity, but we didn't really, at least I didn't get a crystallized point of understanding of what we were getting towards.
Thank you, Carol. Lena, the last word is yours. Please wrap us up.
So it was sort of in there and not explicitly addressed, but I think the way that we now as a civilization in the West is realizing our colonial heritage and what that has caused other people is actually part of our Bildung today, because that's the kind of self-reflection that we need as individuals and as cultures, as countries. One of the most prominent sponsors of Bildung in Denmark was actually the richest man in Denmark, who owned 1,000 people in St. Thomas and St. Croix. So, I mean, there's this, I mean, nothing is easy, and we need to, it's not black and white. And whenever we look at history, there are all these wonderful people who did awful stuff. And we need to live with that and accept that. And we can't change history, but we can change how we behave today and how we treat other people. And I mean, we have to speak up when somebody is racist or, misogynist, and we need to stand up for what is right and good and true. And I think the postmodern culture has sort of taken away a lot of that ability, because it's not just that you need the courage to speak up against what is morally wrong. You also just have to speak up against the people who say that nothing is morally worse or better than anything else. So it's like at a meta level, you can't even say that there is good or bad things. So it's kind of a double attack on what is the right and good thing to do. So I think Bildung is more important than ever, particularly as new technologies are wreaking havoc on a lot of structures in society and families. And I think that education is perhaps the best investment you can make as a society, and not education towards a goal, but an investment in each individual for them to learn as much as they can.
Thank you so much, Lena. That was a great talk. There's so much more we could share and discuss, but this does bring us to the end of this month's co-op conversation. I'm starting to think of these co-op conversations as part of the Bildung kind of philosophy, because
this is really very Bildung. This is excellent. I can highly recommend it.
Thank you. Put that up on our ads there, Stan. So our next conversation will be taking place on February 7th, 2023, and it's going to feature, I'm looking forward to this, Dr. Bernard Harcourt, Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher, professor of law at Columbia University. And Dr. Harcourt recently published a book titled Cooperation, A Political, Economic, and Social Theory, which I've read as well, and it's a great book. And he will be discussing his book and lessons for cooperatives next month. So please join us then as we continue our efforts around this Bildung objectives. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.